that introduction, Rob. As we said, there's a bit of light relief now. We're going to talk about some soft touch human behaviour topics. That's a joke. Now, when Ken asked me if I could summarise what's known about human behaviour in emergencies in 25 minutes, I said, sure, yeah. But we are going to look at what is a brief overview, focusing on the couple of topics that he asked me to look at. So first of all, the idea of human behaviour in emergencies, but really importantly, this idea that we've been talking about, and certainly is really prevalent in the Green Guide discussions, about maximum egress times. Now, I know it's been a really wonderful and productive day, but we're all getting a bit tired at the end of the day, so I'm going to wake everyone up with a short quiz. Are we ready? Come on back. Way. Oh, that's much better. Okay, so I'm not going to pick on individual tables, but just keep this in mind as I go through this presentation, because my aim is to get you guys to challenge the assumptions that we make about human behaviour in emergency situations. So here's the quiz. You can talk about it with the people on your table. It's going to be multiple choice, nice and simple for this time of day. Guys, what is modern fire and evacuation regulations based on? What are they based on? I'm going to give you 5 options. So we're talking really now about evacuations and movements and times and modelling. Let's have a think about that. So A, is it based on the time taken for the average person to walk 100 metres, so 1.1 minutes? Maybe. Is it B, the assumed minimum for fire and rescue services response time, so about 8 minutes? Is it C, the 95th percentile of total evacuation times from real incidents? Is it D, the average length of God Save the Queen, which is the British national anthem, which I'm told is 2.5 minutes? Or is it E, the longest recorded time a sportscaster continuously shouted the word "go," which apparently is 1.1 minutes, again, a very long time. Just a little note, some of these are fictional. Let's have 10 seconds and talk amongst your table and come up with a decision about which of these you think fire regulations are currently based upon. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Right, so while your subconscious is wrestling with that idea, let's move on to the extraordinarily interesting topic at hand, and that's human behaviour in emergencies. Now, there are 2 ways that people typically realise that they're in an emergency situation. The first is that something happens that they interpret as an emergency. The second, and by far the most common, is some kind of an alarm, so some kind of a notification system. Now, what do people do when they hear an alarm? This is how we would like people to respond when they hear an alarm. So we want them to follow the instructions they've been given, respond immediately, use the egress paths that we so painstakingly designed for them, and move directly or in a timely manner to a place of relative safety. Now, I don't need to tell a room of safety professionals that this isn't really what people do when an alarm goes off. We know that people might misinterpret or ignore cues and instructions. They might interpret information in different ways to each other. They may not move directly to a place of safety. They might engage in other activities. They might seek information about the incident. They might look for other people or their belongings, and generally engage in non-evacuation activities. And really importantly, they might use routes according to familiarity rather than design. So for example, in this room, and if an alarm went off, our first instinct would all be to go out the way that we came in. Not many of us would have noticed that there's an emergency exit sign above the toilets. Probably wouldn't head that way unless we had a situation we needed to take care of in a matter of urgency before evacuating. We would all go out the way that we came in. Now, when we design, typically, and lots of the foundations of the design process is based on this left-hand side, when my contention is we need to design and plan buildings and stadia and other areas for this right-hand side. Our design specifications should be over there. Now, the reason that people do this stuff on the right-hand side is because we may not believe that there's an emergency. If an alarm goes off here, our first thought won't be like, right, that's it, there's a fire. It's definitely an emergency, let's get out here as quickly as possible. It's because as humans, we're biased towards normalcy and optimism. Our first thought is, it's going to be okay. And this kind of bias can mean that we behave in ways which aren't very helpful during evacuations. So, why is it important to understand what people will do? Well, it's important because these kind of behaviors will influence the time taken to reach safety. If we understand what people will do and why they do it, it means that we can compare the performances of different designs. It means that we can look at buildings and stadia and sports ground for the uses that we're considering them for. This idea that they're going to be used for other things rather than sports. And it also helps us to determine the effectiveness of the procedures that we put in place. Because as said before, it's really important whether or not we actually believe we're in an emergency. So risk perception is absolutely key in terms of notification, etc. Now, society already has a view on what people will do if they believe that they're at risk. So, Hollywood, for example, have this idea that if people genuinely think they're at risk, they're going to panic, flail and run and scream and cry and do all that kind of thing. But when looking at real incidents, do people panic when they receive risk? So a number of pieces of research, and sociologists have looked through disasters and lots of different emergencies over the years. And we know that panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. This idea of total irrationality, that you're responding to something in a really visceral way, you're scared, and so you're not thinking straight. This is how society thinks we act when we're in an emergency. But the reality, over years and years of research, is that the behavior in an emergency is usually rational, but it's defined as irrational by third-party observers. So people looking at, in horrendous, tragic incidents, looking at what is reasonable, rational behavior, people trying to move themselves and others to protect themselves and protect others in a very significant and horrendously dangerous situation. That might be interpreted as panic, but it actually isn't panic. Panic is really rare in emergencies and less noticeable. If you truly panicked, you'd probably be sitting there doing nothing and not helping yourself or anyone else. And the reason that this is important is that the idea that panic is normal in an emergency, the idea that this room full of rational thinking people suddenly turn into irrational beasts in an emergency, is a really dangerous idea, because if that was true, then we couldn't plan for anything. It would make planning impossible. It would say we can't predict what people do. And so years of research has gone into trying to establish what human behavior is like. If it's not panic, what do people do? And there's a number of fields, and I won't go through the very dull detail of these fields, but I'll give you 5 highlights here, from protective action decision-making models and emergent norm theory models. And this is what we think people do in emergencies. So we make decisions as part of a social process. So we have a set of social norms, and certainly in sports ground, you can see this really well in football, for example, where you have people who've been going year in, year out to the same grounds with the same people. We make collective decisions. It's not one person. It's not us irrationally deciding what we're going to do ourselves. It's part of a social process. We're rational, but we're not optimal. So in our day-to-day lives, when we make decisions, we choose between a number of options and we choose the best option for us. In an emergency, we're presented with a number of different options and we choose the first one which satisfies our needs. And our needs might be, I'm going to find my child and I'm going to get out of here. We choose the first option available to us that does that. We act according to our perceived role and status, which is really helpful. It means that staff in emergencies step up. We see time and time and time again. Even casual staff, even, you might have a new steward who hasn't been on the job very long. Everyone will feel that sense of responsibility if they perceive that they're in a role or some kind of status. And we're altruistic rather than selfish. We don't elbow everyone out the way. Typically, we help each other. We're not thinking just on a one-track way, which is a lovely finding, I think. And again, just to hit it home, we tend to move towards the familiar. We do the things that we're used to. I was listening earlier to the Old Trafford, the Man U account of the Old Trafford evacuation earlier, and people who left, and it wasn't an evacuation, and it was a potential bomb threat, queued outside to buy burgers. You know, we do the things that are familiar to us, even when we're in an emergency. And that's okay. But it also means that we don't realize that what we're doing can be unhelpful or unproductive to the evacuation cycle. So, for example, last year in Dubai, there was a crash landing of an aeroplane, and footage showed from the fuselage of the plane filling up with smoke, and everyone was still getting their bags from the overhead lockers, which caused an immense queue, and very tragically someone died in that. But these behaviours are rational and predictable, so we can incorporate them into our planning. There was an enormous piece of work done as a result of the World Trade Center incident into the human behaviours that went into that, and that has really informed the latest thinking in evacuation behaviour and modelling. And what was found is that who people were before an incident didn't change. They didn't suddenly become irrational, and this is a desperate, desperate situation. They still engaged in activities that they were used to. People finished eating their breakfast before evacuating. Plane had hit the building. One woman put on a full tracksuit before evacuating. People sent emails, stayed on calls, totally normalized the situation before making rational decisions to leave. And so looking at the processes that people go through can be really useful in making sure that we are providing enough information and providing the kind of designs that will enable effective evacuation. And there was an enormous piece of work done by Gwynn and Kuligowski about this, and they were looking at this cycle of decision-making that people make. And it's the flowchart they came up with could cover this whole floor, probably. So I've boiled it down to 5 key points. So we receive external cues. Now that could be communication from someone else. It could be a text message. It could be physically seeing a fire or some kind of other threat. We then perceive that. So we have our own social way of perceiving things, and it could be that you don't trust the reliability of the source if it came through by text message, or you don't believe what's happening is happening. You then interpret that in the context of all the other cues that you've been given, you analyze it, and then you have some kind of response. And the reason that this arrow goes back up to the top is because the response that you make can then feed into other people as an external cue, and people do follow the leader and act in a herd way. Now, of course, these 4 are influenced by the people themselves. So these are the human factors that matter, so physical attributes, cognitive attributes. It's all in the context of the experience that we've had. Again, if we've gone to a sports ground repeatedly, we will behave differently to people who are visiting it for the first time. But as safety professionals, we can influence the top 3 here. We can influence the way cues are presented. We can use research to make sure that they're perceived and interpreted the way that we want them to be. So we can apply this knowledge of human behavior, and we can look at it in the context of flow rates, things that we tend to measure. So how quickly people evacuate, how they respond to the incident, the actions that they perform, the route and exit use. And they might get a consultant. So this is Brocklehurst in 2001 looked at Ladies' Day at Ascot and looked at the familiarity of exit usage and how they could optimize the process there. So there's lots of really cool things we can do, and obviously micro-simulation is something that's been used more and more. But how is all of this currently represented in planning? How is all of this really complicated behavior represented in planning? Well, it's boiled down to this idea of maximum egress times. This is the second thing I said I'd move on to. So we've all seen in various guides, and certainly the green guide's the one that's been of the most talked about today. So we have this concept, which is going to be changing or being developed upon in the future, of maximum egress times. Hopefully you can see my highlights here. So we all know the 8 minutes. Normally 8 minutes for calculation purposes, and then for evacuation you have this 2.5 minutes to 8 minutes. And this 2.5 minutes you see everywhere. So we have the building codes here from 2010. You'll see that use 2.5 minutes to calculate your stair width. You'll use it to, it's very tiny here, to calculate your final exits and how people merge together. For stadia, or any building that has more than 10,000 people in it regularly, you have to look at risk assessment for large places of assembly. And again, here we have, for normal risk premises, 2.5 minutes. And so I started looking at where do we get this 2.5 minutes from? Some of you might remember my very outdated slide at the start. And this is the Empire Palace Theatre fire in 1911. So in Edinburgh, just over 100 years ago, there was a fire in this theatre. A lamp went on fire on stage, and the actors had realized it. What did the audience do? Nothing, because they were biased towards normalcy and said, it must be part of the show, I'm sure it's fine. So they realized they had to indicate to the audience somehow that this actually wasn't okay. And so they got the orchestra to stop playing the song that they were playing and to play a new song to try and encourage people to leave. And they recognized after that there's 3,000, I was going to say spectators, 3,000 theatre goers, audience members here, and it took 2.5 minutes to get 3,000 people out of the Empire Theatre fire. And that figure is the basis of our fire and evacuation regulations. Now, no one was standing outside of the Empire Palace Theatre with a stopwatch, because that's not what happened. So they don't actually know it was 2.5 minutes. They estimated it on the average length of God Save the Queen, as played by a full orchestra. Who got that at the start? Option D. A few people. So when we're looking at these magical numbers that appear in guidance, we really need to think about where they come from. And if anyone can tell me the similar story for 8 minutes, I'll certainly buy you a beer. Now, things have changed since 1911. This, I think, is a Liverpool game in 1911, I think. Things have changed in a number of ways. We have a more diverse spectator profile. In general, in our population, people are getting older, we're getting wider, we're getting slower, we're more likely to have reduced mobility. And the flow rates that we're currently designing, our stadia, our buildings, beyond this 2.5 minutes, the flow rates that we're using are designed for this kind of demographic, not for the upcoming demographic. So it's time to get into a bit of a crisis mode about fire engineering and the fact that our flow rates are rapidly coming out of date. So things are changing enormously. And as has been highlighted, and is certainly going to be highlighted with the redevelopment of the Green Guide, there isn't a one-size-fits-all egress time. Now, Stadia are very reluctant to release their times. Potentially, that's because maybe they don't meet the 8 minutes, I don't know. But here are some of the ones that I found, and I think the last two here are really interesting. You have 34,000 exiting in 10 minutes, 33,000 exiting in 4 minutes, both entirely safe by all other measures. So do we need to have a time that is applied to all? I would say probably not. But it doesn't mean we don't need to consider it. My favorite one that I was looking at was the Bernabeu in Madrid. And it took, I think, 15 minutes to run a drill there. And in a different situation where there was an evacuation there, this guy took his opportunity, big Real Madrid fan, took his opportunity to run onto the pitch and to take a selfie, which of course held up his evacuation time really significantly. And what the real events that I've managed to find information about have shown is that egress is not the same as evacuation. Egress, so our stadium might every Saturday kick out totally safely, well in 8 minutes, or something else which is equally as safe, and we think that's fine, that's what it's going to be like in evacuation. It's not the same. In an evacuation, you're not ready to go at the end of the match. If you're just egressing on a normal day, you're ready to go, you know what time you need to leave, you know that the pitch, that the players have left and that you're going to go home and you've got a route and you've got a plan. If it's an evacuation, it's a totally different situation. And egress we can measure this. And we do, all of the time. All of the movements in stadium and turnstiles and CCTV, we have all of that. But evacuation, we need to forecast. And we can't use egress to forecast evacuation. It is a totally different experience. But luckily, we have more tools at our disposal, and we've heard a lot at the conference, I think, about micro-simulation tools. So we have the theories that I've spoken about already, and also the ability to collect more data. We're all sitting on, in our sports ground, an absolute ton of data that could be used and repurposed for wider safety reasons. And while individually, we make our own decisions, collectively, once you get thousands of people into one place, people become very predictable. Big hordes of football fans who go to the same stadia are very, very predictable in the patterns of movement. And so we can start using these micro-sim models to predict. Now, this is one of the less sexy-looking evacuation models. I appreciate that, this lovely brown look. But this model is building Exodus, and it has developed the very first seating algorithm, which looks at how people move alongside rows of seats, which I know is a hot topic now with this idea of persistent seating. And it's used a number of experiments and found the behaviors and the response times according to where you're positioned away from a vomitory, which is really, really valuable. So when you're looking at evacuation models and pedestrian models and microsimulation models, it's wise to consider the applications in which they've been used. So there's many you could choose, but I would absolutely advise looking at those which are designed for the kind of grounds and the kind of situations that you're considering. So with ongoing work into this area and ongoing research, I spent 10 years researching evacuation of people with reduced mobility and these kind of models. There's groups all around the world looking at this. We know more about this than ever, and we can forecast with more confidence than ever before. And we do it by comparing a number of scenarios. Oh, is it going to work? Oh my God. No, it's not. Imagine, if you will, a very nice running microsimulation model. So these computational tools can provide enormous insight. So if you're comparing a new security procedure or a new search regime, and you want to know how that will impact the ongoing flow outside of your stadium, you can run hypothetical models. You can look at the changing nature of our threat by running different scenarios and running different kinds of threat situations in the stadium. You can look at the movement of people with reduced mobility, you can look at the movement of your normal fans, but also if you're planning that big U2 concert or Rod Stewart concert, you can look at the, I would argue, maybe more slow-moving crowd. Or if you're in Festival Republic and you're looking at the movement of teenagers. For the first time, we can use this computational laboratory to test stuff before it happens. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a solution to every problem. But because the theory is now there, because the computational power is now there, we now have the ability to test this stuff like we never have before. And we can use this to engineer better experiences. So beyond safety, we can use this to engineer experiences. Rob, how am I doing for time? Okay. 5 minutes, I speed up. This isn't a sports ground, this is Houston Airport. The reason I have this up here is because at Houston, they realized they were getting a ton of complaints. People were not having a happy experience in their baggage handling areas. And so they said, okay, we want to fix this. We want people to have a positive experience on our airport. So they hired a load more baggage handlers. And they reduced the wait time down to 8 minutes, right? That should be fine, according to what we know. So people were waiting for 8 minutes, and they were still complaining. And so the guys at Houston were like, well, what's going on? So they decided to try a new solution, and they realized that people were leaving the plane, walking for 1 minute, and then waiting at the baggage handling area for 7 minutes. So they created one of those awful, you've seen them at Disney, those corals of queuing. They created this long walkway so that the people were walking for 6 minutes, and then only waiting for 1 or 2 minutes. And the complaints dropped to 0. Same time, no extra money, and the complaints had dropped to 0. So research has shown that it may not be about this length of time if we're looking at how happy people are in egress or in other situations. It might be about the time spent in activity. And now that you know this, you'll see this everywhere you go when you see sort of queue lengths that are a bit too long, or you might see when you're next to a lift or an elevator, people put loads of mirrors there to distract you, because we hate waiting. We hate feeling that we're queuing or waiting. So we can use this knowledge of human behavior to make sure that the experiences in our sports ground are optimized. But we also can model the experience of different types of spectators. So we can look at what happens. So this is an example of egress, and I'm aware it's very hard to see, probably from the middle of the room there. This is some work that we did with Steve Story from Newcastle United. And this is the egress of St James's Park. So Newcastle wanted to compare the different experiences of home and away fans depending on where they allocate the seating for home and away fans. So we're looking on the left-hand side. You can see the away fans are in red and the Newcastle fans are in black. So this is I'm told, maybe Newcastle, Sunderland, I don't know. And then on the right-hand side, you can see they're positioned in a different place. And what we can do is we can look at the patterns of crossover between different types of supporters. We can look at how long it takes them to get out, look at the different levels of congestion. We can compare it with what happens in reality and make sure that we have validated these models. But we can find out areas to highlight to the police, to highlight to our stewards, to help with training in terms of testing before reallocating, for example, home and away supporters, to find out areas of comfort and areas where you might need to look at relieving congestion around the park. So, given that I'm near the end now, so to conclude, 5 key points. Why we should consider human behaviour. Firstly, it can help you, certainly if you use something like a microsimulation model, it can help you demonstrate that your ground is safe and resilient, so you can test these threats. You can accommodate the modern crowd, so instead of relying on guidance, which isn't designed for the crowds that we currently see. You can optimize major event planning and look at the repurposing of sports ground. One that's very close to my heart and that I've been working on for years is ensuring accessibility for people. So this is something that can be tested in advance and increased in terms of safety, but also in terms of experience for our people with reduced mobility, for example. And importantly, learn these safety lessons before incidents, not afterwards. Typically in safety, we find that it's the big incidents that change things. And using this kind of approach will mean that we can find out these issues well in advance. I was asked to bring it back to leadership because that's the theme of our conference. And in terms of leadership, the world looks to the UK and all of you guys for best practice in sports ground safety. And my view is that by relying on evidence and not just by assumption, we can increase this. And I want to end on wiser words than me. So this is from the start of the conference. Be restless, said Ian Ritchie. Share best practice, said Karen, and guard against complacency. So let's not wait for another incident before we start looking towards the future. And of course, if in doubt, God save the Queen. Thank you.